what process does MKC use, and how do we feel our knives are better, or what makes them really, really good knives? Hey guys, we've been getting some questions lately about what the difference is between the knives that I've made in the past, my hand-forged custom knives, versus the knives that we make today with MKC and the process that we use today. Really more in reference to the kind of blades that we make and how we do the blades themselves. So there's really three kind of ways you generally can make a knife. You can forge a blade, you can stamp out a blade, like with a fine blanking machine, or you can do stock removal, and stock removal can happen in a few different ways, and we'll kind of get into each of these. So let's start with the forged knife. Since I was a little kid, I've been forging blades, and the forging of a knife consists of taking a piece of steel, heating it up, and pounding it out. And everybody kind of knows about like the old samurai swords and stuff like that. You know, I get a lot of questions like, oh, is what you do similar to what the samurais did? Yeah, that, and really what I want to get into with the forging is the reason why. For a lot of years, there were forging guys that would claim that a forged blade is far superior to a stock removal knife or something like that. Really, the reason for forging is and there's a few of them. One, it's a blast. It's really fun. It's a cool thing to be able to do. It's kind of a, not a lost art, but it was kind of lost for a while. But it's an art that used to be done in the old days that we can still do today. Two, I really personally feel by doing that forging, you're really putting a lot of heart and soul into that piece, and it becomes more of an art piece when you do that. But three, and the real reason why forging was a thing all along, was it's the best way to utilize material. So if you have a 1-inch wide piece of steel, but you need to make a knife blade that's 1.5 inches wide, you have to do one of two things. You either have to buy steel that's that wide and grind it all the way, or you have to utilize the material you have and hammer that down and stretch and pull that steel to get the shape and the width and the dimensions that you're looking for. What that does is that actually cuts down on waste. So, you know, if you think about back in the 1800s, you didn't just go to a steel store and buy a big piece of steel and laser cut out a blade and throw that steel away. In fact, a lot of that steel was shipped, you know, across the ocean, you know, long, long ways to be able to use that steel. And the last thing you wanted to do was take that steel and throw it away. You had to utilize every little piece. So they would use pieces of steel that they had at their disposal, and they would repurpose a lot of stuff. You know, the idea of repurposing where you have maybe an old wagon wheel sitting in a boneyard on your farm, and all of a sudden you need to make something else. You can actually use a forge to reshape that steel, to bend it, to fold it, to do whatever you need to do to make hinges for a gate, remake a new wagon wheel, parts for a wagon, plow shears, things like that. So forging really is a great way to utilize material, to not waste anything, to use everything up. So if I have a piece of steel that's only, say, 5 inches long, I can actually forge a blade out on each end of that and maybe get 2 small knives out of that one piece that really wasn't even big enough for one stock removal knife. Let's move on to stamping knives. Stamping is a process that's done in industry, quite frankly, really done mostly overseas, like China and big factories. They have fine blanking machines. And there are factories in the US that actually do fine blanking for other things. You know, when you see thin stainless steel parts, you're gonna make hundreds of thousands or millions of them. They will fine blank out a machine where basically there's a die and it presses at a quick rate of speed. It presses out a piece of steel, and bam, you have a part that's nice and finished. It really does a pretty good job of having nice clean edges and clean cuts. It's very accurate and it's repeatable. So fine blanking is a really good thing for the industry for making a lot of parts in a repetitious model. Fine blanking is very expensive. It's an expensive machine, expensive processes, and you really have to have the demand to do thousands and thousands or millions of parts. The other thing about fine blanking is you're limited on the thickness of steel that you can work. efficiently and effectively. So because you're pressing out a pattern, it generally works better on thinner materials. Now let's go to stock removal, and this is really what the other half, you got the forged world in the knife world, and then you have the stock removal world. Stock removal is a matter of taking a piece of steel that's, say, a rectangle that you buy from a store, put your pattern on it, your knife pattern or anything else you're making, and you either grind, cut out, laser out, whatever you want to call it. You're going to remove that material, that excess material, and throw that stuff away generally, or try to recycle it. Stock removal is generally more known in the knife world as someone who grinds with a belt or bandsaws with a bandsaw in their shop out a pattern and then grinds kind of to the final finish. Stock removal is definitely slower, obviously, than like a fine blank or even a laser, but it's quite a bit quicker than forging. The other advantages with stock removal is it's quite frankly, it's an easier process. Forging takes a lot longer to get good at. Stock removal is definitely an effective way to get a blade nice and straight and clean. When you forge, some of the drawbacks with forging when you're not good is that blade ends up kind of wonky when you're done. It's got dents in it, it's crooked. You have to be kind of a better knife maker to learn how to straighten that blade out on a grinder. That takes time. You can have waste by throwing knives away that you screw up. Trust me, I've done plenty of that. Stock removal really, though, is a very effective way to make a knife. It's the way that I suggest all people start making knives. That's how I started, by making knives, stock removal method. Learn how to grind, learn how to heat treat a blade, most importantly. Finish grind, hand sand, polish, all those things, and then do your fit and finish on a handle or a guard. Those all teach you how to be a good knife maker before you add the complication of forging into it. So, what makes a better knife? And the answer really isn't in any of those processes. The answer is in the steel that you're using and in the heat treating methods that you use and how you work that blade. So let's take forging, for example. You can absolutely make a stellar blade. You can use great material. You can do everything right from thermal cycling and your heat treating, all of those processes, and make an amazing blade. On the other side of that, you can overheat a blade really bad when you're forging it. You can basically be melting it the whole time you're forging. You can have a lot of grain growth in the structure of that steel. It's a process where you can do a lot of abuse and a lot of damage to the steel along the way. And then if you don't do the correct thermal cycling and annealing processes, you treat that blade, and it's really no good. So you can have the same piece of steel, and one guy can forge it and it can be phenomenal. The other guy can forge it without the experience or the knowledge, and he can screw it up. And it's hard for the customer because when you're just standing there looking at a knife, you can't tell which is which. You actually don't know which guy knew what he was doing and which guy didn't. So if you're gonna buy a forged knife, try to buy it from a reputable maker. That's a great thing about the Master Smith and Journeyman test in the American Bladesmith Society. Those makers have been forced to go through a testing process to prove their knowledge and to prove their abilities. Now, with stock removal, same thing. You can make a great knife, but if you don't heat treat it correctly, it doesn't matter. So you can grind the prettiest blade and do all the fanciest stuff you want. If you screw up the heat treat part in the oven, the blade's not worth anything. And same thing with fine blanking. Fine blanking tends to be done with cheaper materials, more on mass production scale. I would generally say, if you find a stamped out fine blank knife, it's probably not gonna be as good as a stock removal knife or a custom knife from a maker who's actually paying attention more to the heat treating process. So this all leads to the question about what process does MKC use and how do we feel our knives are better or what makes them really, really good knives. We use more of what you call that stock removal process. Our blades are lasered out. We just don't have the ability to hand forge every single knife on scale of thousands of knives. We don't use fine blanking. We want to use thicker steel. We want to use really high quality steel in our knives. The laser cuts out blades accurately the same every time. Our heat treating process is absolutely dialed in. It's critical to us. That's the most important part of the process. And secondly, the most important thing would be behind heat treating is how you grind your blade. And that's really, I think, what sets a lot of what we're doing apart. It's steel selection and heat treat. And then it's also our edge geometries, how thin we make our knives, the skeletonizing and the things we do to try to make it more ergonomic, lighter weight. Our blades are strong. The steel selection that we're using is top notch. All of those factors that play in from my experience in the custom knife making world are put into our process with MKC. Just because a knife is lasered out versus forged doesn't mean one's better or not. It's really about the process following those techniques that you're using about what makes a blade great. So that's our process. That's the difference between forged, stamped or fine blanked, and stock removal. So if you have any other questions about the forging process, the American Bladesmith Society has a great website. There's a forum there that's good to learn about. There's a lot of guys doing stock removal stuff. A lot of videos out there about how to make knives in that instance. Go check that stuff out. And thanks again for following MKC and for all your guys' support.